Seven Blue Skies channel brings you a new Dr. Rifat Ismail adventure. Paranormal, Book 3, Part 1, Legend of the Loch Ness Monster, by Dr. Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq. Introduction. Name, Dr. Rifat Ismail. Occupation. Before my retirement, I was a professor of hematology in several universities in Europe and America, but my main hobby is ghost hunting. By choice or force, I found myself an unwanted guest in dozens of graves, palaces, and haunted houses, and my host was either a werewolf, a ghost, or a vampire with sharp fangs shining in the dark. What a full life I have lived. I wonder, what will I tell you about today? Shall I tell you about the spiritual deal I made with Dr. Lucifer? Or maybe tell you how I faced the zombie which rose from its grave? Or tell you about Dr. Frankenstein's experiment? Or maybe about my confrontation with Achiram I and the Pharaoh's curse? I don't know. For those of you who missed my previous stories, I say you have missed interesting and thrilling moments, and I advise you to find them and read them. And as for those who have read previously, for you I say, I'm not done yet. My memory is still strong, containing loads of terrible events I have faced in my long life. And now, I think I shall tell you my story of the mysterious Loch Ness Monster. If my memory does not betray me, the events took place in the latter half of 1964. Yes, that's it. And now, turn on the lights, close the door, and turn the pages. I will tell you my story of the Loch Ness Monster, so don't interrupt me. 1. Memories. The time, midnight. The place, near Urquhart Castle, in a small boat in the middle of the lake. And the cold fog sleeps lazily on the surface of the placid water to the extent that we cannot see each other's faces. The boat rocks gently. The era, late July 1964. The event, Sir James McKillop had decided to prove his theory. In silence, he looked at the lit hands of his watch, and then looked at me, at Maggie, and at Ewan. While stressing every syllable, he said, "It's time. Remember, gents, there is still time to back out. I want to hear your consent once more." He then turned to Maggie, asking, "Maggie?" She mumbled something, meaning continue, and fastened the necklace around her neck. "Dr. Ismail?" I knew that the gates of hell would open in the coming minutes, and that only God knows what tomorrow's sun would rise upon. But I was being driven down a road with an unknown destination. I simply nodded my consent. "Fraser?" asked Sir McKillop. "Please, let's continue." Sir James coughed lightly and then put his hand into his pocket and said, "Then, what will be, will be." And he took out a small ivory horn and blew in it. There is an old saying which claims that every underwater cave in the lakes of Scotland contains a legendary monster. I wasn't aware of this saying at that time, in the year 1964, but such is my destiny. After each of my stories, I realized what a fool I had been yesterday, and even how naive I was just seconds ago. I always fancy I have reached the peak of wisdom before realizing in my next adventure that another peak still remains, one which I know absolutely nothing about. But how did I not understand then that everywhere I go there are monsters and devils? And as long as there are monsters and devils, I must necessarily meet them. It's my destiny. I have no fault or intention in it. But I, for the 1000th time, confess that I was naive. It was not the first time I had visited Scotland, and it was not the first time I entered Dundee University. I had come to this country during my doctorate studies abroad, and I had close friends here. The Scots are real Brits, but they're a lot different from the British we know. They're very kind and friendly people, devoid of coldness and snobbery, and they also lack the fiery temper of the Irish. Long, happy stories are forever engraved in my memories of Dundee University. And today, after about 10 years, I return to my dear friends Mackenzie, MacArthur, McDavid, and I don't know why all Scottish surnames start with Mac, and a majority of the men are called Andrew. Remind me to ask about that, if time allows. What's important is that I met my lovable professor, Sir James McKillop, and was really amazed by him. His white hair, his strange sideburns, his thick eyebrows. He stood out for me as one of the medical giants we see in the huge medical volumes, their names always preceded by the title Sir. Then there is his friendly simplicity and his learned remarks and tidy thinking. For all of this, I adored him like a teenage girl crushing on her handsome teacher. He shook my hand warmly, and I was so pleased he remembered me after all these years. "Dr. Ismail, isn't it?" The left corner of my mouth shook as I said courteously, "Yes, Rifat Ismail." "Ah, my failure of a student." I smiled in embarrassment at his compliment, not knowing how to respond, but he continued, "I heard you went back to Egypt and opened a private practice where you sucked the pitiful blood of your country's people, forgetting everything about scientific research. Don't deny it." I strongly protested that this never happened and that, up until the current moment, I owned nothing except my apartment in Cairo and had not changed at all. "Well then, why did you stop attending the London conferences?" Should I tell him the reason, which might seem silly in his view? For a moment I could not explain to him, but he surprised me with a more specific and dreaded question. "Is there any news about our colleague, Dr. Richard Cummings?" I smiled in embarrassment and said benignly, "I haven't seen him since the hematology conference in 1959. "My point exactly," he said doubtfully, while looking me in the eyes with his long, steady gaze, seeing past all my claims. "He invited you to his country home back then, and then nothing. No one knows anything about him now except that he traveled to Australia. He quit his job, cut all ties, and did not even leave a forwarding address. Do you know what happened back then? You were the closest to him and the last to see him." Apparently I was obliged to tell him the story of Count Dracula and Catherine's transformation into a vampire, and my escape in the night. All of this enough to bring out the mockery and sarcasm of this awesome professor, or his doubts about my sanity. In reality, I had buried this bitter memory deep within myself, and had thrown tons of the dust of my daily problems over it. I did not want it to return, to bother me again in my life. I told Sir James enigmatically, "It's a long story." "Well then, please tell it to me tonight." "Here?" I asked, confused. "No," he said. "I'm inviting you to my manor house in Inverness-shire to spend the weekend, and there we will spend a pleasant night in which you tell me everything. A full itinerary awaits you." In all honesty, I tried to avoid this situation as I was no longer keen on such invitations from these British professors. The full itinerary prepped for me by Dr. Richard Cummings ended with my spending the night next to Dracula's mummy with a teenage vampire. So what kind of full program had this professor made for me? But he was firm in his invitation, and I didn't have the guts, as the Brits say, to refuse his offer. "My manor is a short distance from Loch Ness," he said, while winking at me, thinking I knew what that name meant. I really knew nothing about it, and it only caught my attention because of the letter Ch, which he pronounced correctly and confidently. The Scottish frequently use the letter Ch in their speech, which was surprising to my ears. Thus I repeated, "Loch Ness?" "I mean Lake Ness. Of course you know that the names of all Scottish lakes start with the word Loch, except for Monteith. The word Loch means lake." "Got it," I said, "but I don't know much about Scotland." Sighing, he replied, "And that is your problem. You studied here for 2 years, and yet never even tried to learn anything about the country in which you were studying. Isn't it time to do so?" "Of course," I answered, "but "Enough excuses," he said. "You should get settled and organized, and then we'll meet there at 5 p.m. sharp. And remember," he said while giving me a meaningful look, "Maggie will be." And the melodies exploded, one after the other, in the sea of my memories. Tender, fragile Maggie who could walk on grass without bending a single blade. The honest blue eyes, innocent to the point of making one feel like the devil. The crazy golden hair. Our holding hands in Edinburgh Street. And young dreams. And my idiotic attempt to appear confident and a gentleman. And her naive attempt to play the mysterious lady who understood life. and then we would throw away our masks and laugh like children. Maggie was Sir James' only daughter. She was studying physics in Dundee University when we met, and somehow I realized that her father did not object to our relationship, maybe even encouraged it. And the days passed, and our emotions reached a peak from which they ever afterwards declined. My studies abroad had finished, and she told me kindly, "Stay here, Rifat. Stay with us. My dad will find you a respectable job in his hospital, and will be so happy." With tenderness I replied, "Come with me, Maggie, to Egypt, to my sunny and warm country and its good people. We'll be happy together." "But I can't leave my studies and my country," she protested. "And I can't let my country down after sending me here to study, and I won't leave my mother and sister." A long conversation ensued, after which we reached a vital agreement, which was to agree to disagree. And we separated. And for 2 years we maintained correspondence. And then, you know how these things happen. I don't remember who stopped writing first, but we did stop writing to each other. I had nothing left of her except for a dim trace, like the residual print of a child's moist kiss upon the cheek, which dries quickly but leaves a refreshing effect in the soul for some time. Maggie will be there. And there, in the luxurious dining room, I met her after all these years. "Dr. Rifat, I presume?" she asked in jest, while shaking my hand with her cold, porcelain-like hand which I had always been afraid of breaking. Weirdly bowing, I said courteously, "Miss McKillop." She had changed a lot. Today she was about to reach the age of 40, and far removed from that fragile creature I had adored. She had become a woman, and that disappointed me greatly. But I was prepared to regain all the love I had felt towards her if she proved to me that her spirit remained unchanged. Of course, she had not married yet, which was clear from her lack of objection to my calling her Miss. "I'm afraid you've grown more handsome." "And I'm afraid you've become even more charming." She sat next to me at the table, while Sir James sat at the head of the table. To his right sat a pretty, middle-aged lady whom he introduced as Mrs. Elizabeth Gold, the widow of the late Commander R.T. Gold. And to his left a woman with sharp features, whose name he gave as Constance White, and next to her, her husband, an old bald man who regarded me with doubt. It was a luxurious and elegant banquet, which made swallowing any bite an effort not to be taken lightly. Maggie was extremely friendly, and we talked the whole night. But I was drowning in my personal problems with dinner-table etiquette, afraid of appearing rude or uncultured to these aristocratic people, and so I replied to Maggie by nodding, meaning that her talk was very important to me. And finally, dinner was over. The head butler led us down a long corridor strung with old paintings and armored knights holding spears, and on this wall an ancient tapestry depicting moments in Scottish history, that surreal atmosphere which is hard to fathom, and hard to imagine you are really within. It stirs the imagination wildly. Leaning close to the butler's ear, I whispered, "On your father's life, tell me." "Sir," he responded with pride in his deep and elegant voice, as if he was insulted. I continued my question, "Are you sure there are no ghosts in this manor house?" "Sir, I mean," I went on, "isn't this manor haunted by the ghost of Lord So-and-so or Lady Such-and-Such, who come out, for example, when the clock strikes midnight?" He looked at me with doubt, unsure of my sanity, and then laughed coldly. "Ah, the gentleman jokes. I was not aware the gentleman is a comedian. Aha, aha." He then aimed at the sitting room and announced in his prudish manner, "Now, the ladies and gentlemen will be pleased to sit here to take coffee. My master will be right with you." The atmosphere was cheerful in the sitting room, especially with the pure summer breeze bringing with it our dreams. Sir James followed us shortly and started amusing conversations on many topics I don't recall. Then he asked me about Dr. Richard, so I started telling him my story, and I described the atmosphere well, which made all those sitting widen their eyes in horror upon listening. When I started the story of my encounter with a werewolf in Romania, silence overtook the room, and it seemed I had really invaded their minds, which made me puff up with personal pride. Then I told them the story of the caller, and their surprise and interest had reached its peak. They would shout in amazement and terror as the events in the story evolved. I had basically monopolized this conversation, and I overcame my previous social anxiety which had almost ruined my life. Mrs. Gold approached me and said, while stressing each syllable, "You have encountered lots of dangers, Dr. Ismail. You are really an amazing man." With spite, Maggie retorted, "Or just a really good storyteller." I looked at her in surprise. She was jealous. She was really jealous. Well, then, that means I'm still alive in her heart. But her accusing me of telling fabrications chilled my heart so much. I looked into her blue eyes steadily and whispered, "Wow, my dear, you haven't changed at all." "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean that all of your sweetness dissolves and turns into the viciousness of a tiger as soon as you sense danger that threatens your heart." "You're so vain," she cried. "And you love me." And just like that, somehow our hands clasped and the 10 years melted away in minutes. We went into the balcony, looking out at the clear night in the Scottish Highlands around us, as the night breeze whispered its secrets to us and carved our names on the surface of the lake. Lake Ness. And behind us in the sitting room, the others talked and joked as someone turned on a fragile record on the phonograph. The smooth sound of Tino Rossi's voice reached us. He sang in Italian about something unknown, but it surely spoke of my feelings and described my heartbeat at that moment in a way in which I never could. "Maggie," I said, "I don't know anything in life without you. Just long, tiring nonsense. I belong in your eyes." "So you'll stay with me forever?" "Forever." Tino Rossi continued to describe my feelings with unfamiliar words whose meanings I did not know. And tears sprang to Maggie's blue eyes, and her features seemed more delicate to me now. Her familiar, sweet face had returned. But here she shook violently, and I saw her features freeze. She looked into the distance, at the lake water. "Maggie," I asked, "is something wrong?" She pointed in the direction she was looking, saying, "Tell me, do you see something moving on the water, or are my eyes tricking me?" I looked in the direction she indicated, at the lake water moved by the breeze under the starlight. Nothing there. But, truly, there was a strange black mass, like some kind of soft rock, moving slowly on top of the water. It went up and down in sequence, but maintained a steady direction towards the shore of the lake. Narrowing my eyes to see better, I said, "It's just a piece of driftwood." Swallowing audibly, she cried, "No, you don't understand." And she pulled her hand from my arm in the midst of my confusion and stood at the balcony door, calling her father, who was inside. "Daddy, it's Nessie." Nessie? What is this girl talking about? And, other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, how is it my fault that this Nessie, whatever that is, decides to show itself at this particular moment? With his thick cigar clenched between his teeth, Sir James rose like someone stung and exclaimed, "No, surely not. At this time? Impossible." Confidently, Maggie insisted, "Come and look for yourself." Sir James regarded the lake for a moment and then mumbled, "But, by God, it's true. Tell Graham to bring the camera with the zoom lens." Having entered the balcony with the others, Mrs. White said, "It's no use. The flash won't light all this distance." With some annoyance, Sir James agreed with her and again regarded the scene silently. Standing there like an idiot, I understood nothing about this, so I cleared my throat and asked, "What's a Nessie?" Sir James looked at me for several moments, and I thought he would answer me, but he was distracted and ignored my question. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Gold and asked her, "Do you think they saw him in Urquhart?" "I doubt it." And he scratched his head in confusion and mumbled, "But today is the 17th of July. There must be some kind of mistake in my calculations." What's a Nessie?" I asked again. Maggie looked at me with annoyance and returned to her whispered conversation with Mrs. White. "Maggie, "What's up, Nessie?" Looking into the distance, the starlight reflecting in her eyes, she replied, "It's the nickname we Scotch use for the Loch Ness Monster." 3. The Legend of the Lake Monster. The lunar eclipse had obscured the crescent moon that night. That was the explanation. We sat in the living room, the tobacco smoke filling the place while the women began playing cards. The scene I had lived an hour ago had really shaken me. True, it wasn't clear, but it was certain and left no place for doubt. "Yes, it was the eclipse," said Sir James as he scratched his head. "No doubt about it." Curious, I asked him, "Is Loch Ness the biggest lake in Scotland?" No, the biggest is Loch Lomond." "And what is the story behind this monster?" I prompted. With impatience, Sir James narrowed his eyes, blew out cigar smoke, and said cryptically, "It's a long story." He then snuffed out his cigar in a glass ashtray next to him and went on. "The best person to explain this story to you is Mrs. White. Oh, Constance, could you kindly tell Dr. Ismail about the monster?" An old man whose presence I had completely forgotten spoke up. "My wife is an expert on the subject. She has written a book about it." Having grown tired of playing cards, Constance glanced over her shoulder and said without looking at me, "There's not much to tell, really. The story started in the year 1933, when John Mackay, a hotel owner, went for a drive with his wife round the lake, and there they saw what we see, a long, dark, cylindrical body sliding through the water of the lake. And certainly our having both seen it proves it is not an illusion. That is why the news spread, and they started calling this creature the Loch Ness Monster." With doubt, I offered, "But maybe they agreed to make up this story, to become famous, or to promote for their hotel." Constance went on without commenting. "On 11th of May that same year, Alexander Rebo and his father Alistair were walking near the lake and saw the same thing swimming towards Urquhart Bay in a rolling motion. And I finished my cards." And she threw her cards on the table, announcing her victory over Maggie and Mrs. Gold. "You play like beginners, my friends." Maggie protested, asking to play another hand, and Mrs. Gold began shuffling the cards. And while taking her cards, Constance continued her story. "After that, William Brodie managed in his boat to see the creature 2 miles from Urquhart Castle." With curiosity, I said, "Always this Urquhart Castle?" "Yes, that creature is seen every time between Urquhart Castle and Augustus." "There were other times?" I asked. "Yes, it's been seen around 300 times," Constance answered. I made a low whistle, expressing my surprise, so she smiled contentedly and said, "It's always the same description. A long, slender body, somewhere between 6 and 15 meters long, swimming at a speed of 20 knots. And it swims by either rolling or continuously contracting and extending. Some say it has something like a horse's mane, but I'm not confident about that extra detail. And to this day no one has heard its voice." "Have they managed to take a photo of it?" I asked. "Hundreds of pictures," she replied, "but they all happen under the same circumstances, just as we saw it tonight, meaning all the pictures are unclear and undependable scientifically." "And have scientists tried to study the subject?" While arranging her cards, she said, "More than once. The most serious attempt was a trial by the scientist Winrell, who came from Glasgow and brought a team of scouts to spend many days waiting for the creature's appearance. But they weren't successful. Actually, Brighton Circus announced a money prize for whoever captured the beast. But of course you have to find the monster before capturing it, and therefore no one took the prize money. Then there were somewhat successful trials by the Marine Commander R.T. Gold. May he rest in peace." "R.T. Gold?" I wondered. Then Mrs. Gold— "Yes," she answered. "She is his widow." But what a coincidence. Mrs. Gold smiled bitterly and lifted her face to me, saying, "It's not a coincidence. Loch Ness Monster is the one who gathered us here, because all of us are interested in the story." Sir James said in a friendly way, "We're a group of friends searching for the truth, and we will find it. Mrs. White's husband is manager of the Caledonia Canal, which protects the lake, and Mrs. White herself has written the foremost book about the monster." He went on, As for Mrs. Gold, she is the widow of the writer of the second most in-depth book about that creature. And Maggie and I, given our proximity to the scene of the events and having seen it a lot, almost even hit it with my car." "Your car? Does it—" "Yes," said Sir James. "It leaves the lake quite often, to spend time here and there, and a lot of people have witnessed this." I smiled sarcastically and laughed in a low voice. Sir James asked in an irritated manner, "What's so funny? Everything we have told you is scientific fact." I turned to him apologetically and explained that I was not mocking his talk, but rather mocking my strange luck, which always throws me where ghosts lurk or vampires sleep or monsters await. And here Mr. Bertrand White spoke logically. The monster's existence is still debatable. All of the witnesses saw something, but they never saw the full creature breathing fire. In other words, there's something which people witness in this lake, but we don't know what it is. My wife has studied all other possibilities." With impatience alluding to the number of times she had told the story before, Constance explained, "Scientists have thought of everything. They claim this thing is a flock of wild geese, and that it's a school of salmon, or a group of playful dolphins, or a huge squid." "Except the strongest possibility," said Maggie, "was the giant oarfish, a fish native to this region. Its scientific name is Riga—" Mrs. Gold helped her out, saying, "Rigolecus glesni." "Yes," Maggie exclaimed, "exactly what she said. This fish has a dorsal fin much like a horse's mane, and it grows to a gigantic size. It can live for 20 years. It's a perfect match, except nothing we've spoken of here will show in the photos like we actually saw it." Confused, I said, "I don't get it. This thing is not harmful, of course. I mean, all it does is appear at night and stir questions." "That was true," said Sir James, and he gave me a meaningful look and murmured, "Until a month ago." 4. Once again. In the morning, Maggie and I walked hand in hand on Loch Ness beach. Inverness Shire is located in the north of Scotland, in the midst of the Grampian mountain range, and the highest point in all of Britain, called Ben Nevis, can be found in Inverness Shire. And from the peak of Ben Nevis, you can see all the sleepy valleys at its feet, as well as Loch Ness. Actually, Loch Ness is located in the Great Glen between the heights of Grampian and the Northern Highlands. This intermediate location is called Glenmore. As Maggie told me, the lake is the narrowest of all of Scotland's lakes, for parts of it are no more than 1.5 kilometers in width and 266 meters deep. It encompasses an area of 56 square kilometers. I don't know what the use of all these numbers is, but I detail them for geographic accuracy and to prove to dear Maggie that I really was not a failure as a student. Jokingly, I told her, "Maggie, up to now I haven't seen a Scottish man wearing a skirt." Laughing sarcastically, she replied, "Oh, here you go generalizing. It's a folkloric outfit we sometimes wear, not all the time. The same reason why I never saw you wearing a galabeah and a fez hat, though honestly, we always imagined Egyptians like that. And the image of Scots in our heads is that of a man wearing a beret and a skirt, playing bagpipes and drinking whiskey all day." Cheerfully, she said, "Yes, like we imagine the Mexican with a sombrero, a bandolier, and a bottle of tequila, shooting guns all day, and the American as the eternal cowboy, and the German with a thick mustache and overalls, drinking beer. Comic books and movies have ruined your thinking and caused you to stereotype people." "That's true," I conceded, "but the skirt—" "By the way," she said, "it's not a skirt. It's called a kilt. And also, we Scots are not stingy like they describe us on the continent." "That part I have not experienced yet." She laughed sweetly and continued looking at me steadily. "Oh, my angel, I wish I had a more handsome face than this to show you." I clearly realized what crimes the years had done to her face. She is not young and fresh anymore. She is not pure. She has become just another one. But, in spite of everything, she is still amazing. I could fall in love with her again quite effortlessly, and it would be the second love in my life. First, I loved a tender, fragile girl named Maggie, and now I would love a grown woman whose name is Maggie as well. And, of course, one of them will accuse me of cheating on her with the other. As I sat distracted with these thoughts, she continued regarding me and exclaimed, "For heaven's sake, you've gotten really old." "Sorry about that," I said. "I promise to not repeat that mistake again." She laughed and then brought her face closer to mine and whispered, "Forever?" "Huh?" "Will you stay with me forever?" "Until all the stars burn out, and until—" But here she screamed frantically while pointing at the lake. "Did you see that? Nessie is on the move!" Damn it. This bro plans to wreck my nerves, and he only chooses the worst of times, or the best of them, to announce his presence and continue on his pointless trip around the lake. Here is that cylindrical gray body splitting its wave between the waves from afar, dots of water splashing around him. Above water level, about 30 centimeters of him appears, while he resembles a submarine from beneath the waves. Except he looks more limber than metal. It must be a living creature, some kind of huge fish, or a whale, or something like that. I was starting to hate Maggie and her monster, when just then she shouted in amazement, "This has never happened before! None of us has ever seen him in the daytime." And she looked out at Nessie and sighed, "If only we had the camera." Reaching into the small bag I carried, I offered, "I have one, but don't tell me you plan to waste a few shots on that stupid thing." Taking the camera from me and adjusting the focus, she exclaimed, "You had this the whole time and didn't bother to tell me? If he dives down before I take a picture of him, I'm going to kill you." "But I don't get it," I said. "It'll just be another picture which proves nothing. A gray body in the middle of the waves. Plus, the film is black and white, which will make matters even worse. Just a blurry gray mass." "Shh!" She said it while pointing the lens at her target, and she took multiple shots of what she fancied was today's miracle. The film had ended, thankfully, and here, before I understood, she left me standing like a fool and ran towards the manor, waving the camera and shouting, "Daddy, it's Nessie! I took a picture of him in the daytime." I stood alone on Loch Ness beach, staring at that moving thing from afar. With spite, I lifted my fist and shouted in Arabic, which luckily he would not understand, "Days are between us, you rusty sewer pipe." But then I remembered what Sir James had told me the night before, which made me think twice about challenging that creature, and I decided to end my tour and go back to the manor.